Good evening and welcome to the fourth episode of The Rural Condition, produced on behalf of the Architecture Foundation as part of their 100-day studio. I am Niall Maxwell from Rural Office for Architecture, and welcome to this unusual event. I'm sharing my screen, I hope, at some stage. I'm doing my normal thing. Hang on a minute. There we go. And if everybody can see that. Thank you. We're in. So, in previous weeks, what have we been doing? Well, we've been talking to a number of different individuals as a means of discussing the pitfalls and pleasures of rural practice, but also maybe expanding on the role that architects have within the rural condition and how we as facilitators or designers are trying to navigate our way through different communities in different locations around the UK and abroad in Europe. This conversation obviously last week with Graham Bisley at his beautiful home down in Somerset, and obviously discussing the familiar language of rural Ireland with Steve Larkin, not only an architect, professional musician and academic. And then previous weeks with Ryan Kennaghan, keeping the Irish theme together, elevating the ordinary, before obviously meeting John from Tedder Architects in Mallorca, understanding tradition and producing exemplary work both home and away. And then of course Jonathan in the first week ploughing his own furrow on the east of England, and Mary being Mary and really being the star of the show and telling us about this kind of immersive existence that she has up in the Highlands from her base in the middle of Scotland. And it's been interesting, actually. All the feedback that I've had over the last few weeks has all been about Mary. Really seems to have captured the imagination of a number of viewers, both architects and lay viewers alike, really enchanted by her decision-making in terms of her private and professional life. And next week we'll be talking to Takeshi, and we'll also be talking to Tom Randall-Page about the notion of craft and working at the small, intimate scale in rural locations with craftsmen and women, producing some very beautiful work. So lots going on over the next few weeks, but tonight is really starting bizarrely in Deptford. So not really the rural condition, really a small piece of urbanism, I suppose you could call this. Hugh Strange's own house and studio, built really a house within the remains of other structures. And the reason we start this conversation here is Hugh is also the author of another beautiful project in a rural location, and something that we're going to hopefully expand as a conversation about two paradoxical positions on how to approach the rural setting and the restoration of existing buildings. But this building is really quite special, his home and studio. A very pure building, built from CLT, really quite modest in space, but actually a building you never understand the sum of its parts, because you're never really given the big reveal at any given point in time within the space, and hopefully we'll be having a tour with Hugh later on. But the reason for starting in Deptford was because it's a building in CLT which was replicated later on for Drawing Matter as part of their archive, Shadwell Farm. And hopefully we'll be speaking to Neil Hobhouse as well during the programme about this building and the method by which a building is built really to house artefacts of great value, but it is also quite a sculptural object, and a sculptural object that maybe is not necessarily born out of its presence, but more about its expression of construction. And what I like about this building is the way it sits within a very rural context, within a working settlement of buildings. You can see in the background Stephen Taylor's cowshed, and the idea that it is really contributing to something bigger than the sum of its parts. It's what Elizabeth Hatts describes in her publication, in the publication of Hugh's work, as being a sort of background architecture. And I'd strongly recommend this publication, Footnotes, Backgrounds and Sheds, a Drawing Matter archive by Hugh Strange. with some wonderful photographs by Max Creasy, with a really poignant essay by Elizabeth Hatts, which I can sort of draw on with my own work, and I think with the work of many of the people that we've been discussing over the last few weeks. So, of course, this image is probably the iconic image of that proposal, and this image really sits alongside this project by Kate Darby, which is her own studio and adjacent to her own home near Leominster in Herefordshire. And I've stayed here a couple of years ago when I did a day's teaching with Kate, and it is really a really strange piece of theatre. The remnants of a listed building, retained and restored, but then also preserved in a very unusual manner to create incredible intimate spaces. This is the bedroom on the mezzanine above the sitting room. But the sitting room itself, almost like a mise-en-scene, setting up a number of narratives, a number of conversations which you're left to unpick yourself. You can just see the ivy there on the left peeling off the wall, just left as another stage prop. But of course, Kate's work is very broad. She's working locally within Herefordshire and also down in the south of France. But she was also one of the founders of what's this project called, Kate?
Woods.
Thank you. And along with Piers Taylor and others. And this has led to a lovely sort of summer range of installations that's been going on for a number of years, intermittently. I think that must be Piers in the background. And has also led the last couple of years for Kate teaching with Gianni Boxford at Welsh School of Architecture and really working on her own constructed analysis, as she calls it, a way of allowing students to learn and develop skills at the one-to-one before applying them to their own design projects. But what I question about this, and I suppose this is the most important part of the conversation, is that this is a form of theatre, and it's a form of theatre that sits sort of rather incongruously with maybe with the canon of Kate's work as a whole. And that's because, of course, it's a collaboration with her husband, David Connor. And when we look at David's work, David trained as an interior designer and sort of theatre and set designer in the 1970s and 80s, and had an unbelievable period of his career where he was working with Adamant, with Malcolm McLaren, Vivienne Westwood, a number of real movers and shakers within a certain period of time. And his drawings are very evocative of a totally different approach to architecture. And this is evident through his work with, for example, Anish Kapoor back in Seville in the 1980s, producing one of his installations. But also more evident in his showpiece work, Villa Sapu, which is in California, built again in the 1980s. And I implore you, anybody who has time to Google this, you will find an amazing 20-minute film on this house. Lots of power dressing, shoulder pads, and saxophone solos. So I fully, wholeheartedly recommend it to you. But you can see from the language of this architecture that it sits as a great tension with Kate's own interest in the everyday, the manufactured, and the agricultural. And David has a book coming out later in the year called Provocations, which is a very interesting collection of his drawings, very intense sort of collection of his work from the 80s and 90s. So tonight's conversation is called A Material Presence, and this comes from Elizabeth Hatts' essay where she describes Hugh's work, and I thought it was really fairly relevant really for the conversation we're just about to have between Hugh, Kate and David. Welcome all, and thanks for listening. And I'm just going to stop sharing so they can see you. Hello, Hugh. You're with us. Oh. And you're obviously in Deptford at the moment. David and Kate, can I start with you? Because there is a strange thing which I didn't realise until I started talking to you about this episode, that you all know each other anyway before this event.
Well, David discovered Hugh.
Yeah, I invented Hugh.
You invented Hugh.
And made him famous. No, we taught together in Bath, and we kind of hit it off. And you know, I'm a huge admirer of Hugh's work, actually, and that's about it. And Hugh, actually, he showed me his site before it was built in Wiltshire, Shapwell Farm, and we walked around the site looking at it, and kind of by coincidence, he came here and looked at our old ruin here, and he gave us his advice about how to proceed. And we took absolutely no notice of it, and and got on with it. I don't think I gave him any advice about the archive.
But David,
I've done quite a few crits for Kate as well since then.
well, I was going to say, when David invited you to stay, and I realised that the way that you think about architecture is exactly sort of totally gels with what I'm interested in, and you talk about it brilliantly. So I invited you to do some crits for my students, and I really like the way that you critique work, because you have this incredible way of talking about the kind of ordinary in a context of the extraordinary, and a kind of, you know, the weight of architectural history, talking about something that's very kind of, you know, in everyday life. And I really like that combination.
That's an interesting point though, Kate, isn't it? Because there is a subtlety to your work, Hugh, which sort of comes from having to read into it quite a lot, and it's working at a number of different levels. I think the essay by Elizabeth was quite particular in the way she talks about details and the way in which you have a sort of layering of the composition of the building. Could you maybe expand on that a little bit for us?
Yeah, maybe. Actually, I'll say something slightly different now. In that, I suppose, in relation to David's work and your description of my interests and my work, I suppose that we did hit it off. It was like 10 years ago or so, and we hit it off, and it kind of made me. I was kind of thinking this last day or two. It's a bit. Someone I can't remember who. Robert Mull or someone in the 90s described British architects as roundheads and cavaliers. And I very much see David and I as round, you know, I'm a kind of quintessential roundhead, I think, in my paring things back as much as I can. And David has a theatricality, which is quite other, but there's a kind of enjoyment of what each other does in that. So, that's not quite an answer, but it's something about the kind of round-headedness of what I try and do. The looking for something, I suppose, paring stuff back to find some kind of modest proposition, which nevertheless has integrity to it.
Okay, so it's being aesthetic without being puritanical, maybe, is it?
Yeah.
So David, you're being labelled as a cavalier, which is probably right.
Yes, I like that, but I've always wanted to be a roundhead. I've always wanted to be able to put materials together as well as Hugh, or, you know, I've always wanted to do that, but I just can't. You know, I just can't do that, and it's a bit like, you know, I'm really very dyslexic, but I really, really admire people who can spell. You know what I mean? It's that kind of admiration for people like who can do things that I can't. So but we talked earlier, and Hugh was saying he liked my work, and I was quite taken aback by that. I was really very, very flattered, and I was quite really surprised, because I wouldn't have kind of put myself in his.
It's a kind of vicarious pleasure, David, in the things that I can't do, the things that I kind of hold myself back from that theatricality.
Well, I think that's not uncommon with friendships as well. Sometimes you have admiration for people who are the polar opposite from you, because they have those qualities that you just can't release from yourself. How does it work then as a couple? Because obviously, Kate, if you're empathising with Hugh, and David is very much this more theatrical character, how did it actually come together as a working partnership for this project? So obviously you share studio space, but you don't work with each other every day, do you?
I mean, it's a classic case of opposites attract. And I think that made it very difficult for us to work together for many years. But there was also a kind of disjuncture experience. You know, I think I was had come late to architecture and was studying architecture when I first met David. It was before I'd got my part 2 even, and he had his own practice. And you know, now 25 years on, we're sort of more evenly matched, and we came together really on this project. And I think that the skills and the different approaches that we have were really complementary in this project. And actually, it was the first time where we appreciated one another's differences.
First time we didn't have an argument.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the first time we're more than the sum of our parts rather than less than the sum of our parts.
Yeah. We don't work together very often, but we do work together occasionally, in fact, when we have to.
Well, I think...
Are you working together in France at the moment?
Sorry?
We are working on a project in France at the moment, yeah.
Okay, and can you expand on that? What it's for and why you're collaborating rather than working independently?
Well, we've typically tried to collaborate on projects that we've had some kind of ownership over. So the project in France is for a developer, but it's on a piece of land that we are kind of brokering a sale of and have a connection to, sort of belongs to a member of the family. And we sort of care about how this land is developed. And it's also an opportunity to do a much larger scale project than I've worked on before. And I don't know, maybe David too.
It's a big project. It's like,
it's about
old people's
80 apartments, 50% of which is social housing.
Yeah.
On a sort of 0.6 hectare site, 6,000 square meter site. And it's very challenging. It's very kind of commercially constrained. It's a very commercial developer and it's very constrained economically, but it's a very beautiful site. And it's a site we know really well because we've lived in France. We went to France and lived there for 1.5 years because we owned some land there, and we went to work on it together originally when we first got together. So it's a project which we're both invested in, and I think one in which both of our skills can where we can be more than the sum of our parts, hopefully.
Great. Hugh, I think the purpose of this kind of two-way conversation tonight was very much about the architectural approaches, and obviously in a very simplistic way I had pigeonholed you two together because you were providing us with the buildings built within ruins, and David and Kate were obviously providing us with the building wrapped around a ruin. Could we maybe start by doing what we were intending to do, which was have a tour? You were going to go outside, David and Kate, and maybe sort of just give us a bit of context that we can't see on the photographs.
Okay.
First, yeah.
So if you...
We'll go outside.
You go outside and work your way around, and I'll have a chat with Hugh while you're getting yourself sorted.
Okay.
So obviously, Hugh, what's that?
So I'm going to show you a couple of models while they're getting ready. This is my house, which is, I'm in the office, which is there, and the house is kind of that matchbox type thing dropped in there. And I think that was something Niall Hoppice and I talked about a fair bit at the beginning, this idea of a kind of CLT box dropped onto the site. And it's interesting in terms of the urban environment, the kind of density of it. And then this is Shatwell. And there we have the Barton and the silos and the main barn that Clancy Moore have just done some work to, and the archive with the existing shell on one side and the kind of valley side there.
So what led you to make the decision to build it in CLT? Because obviously you cut your teeth with this building and understood the pros and cons of it. I presume that was that a conversation with Urban that you?
Certainly, Urban and Liam Dewar there were instrumental to both projects. Neil Hobhouse at Drawing Matter had seen my house, was interested by it, was interested about kind of developing the same idea in a different context. And actually it was neat. So my house is roughly 100mm CLT with insulation on the outside. And we talked about this idea of my house, I suppose, conceptually dropping a box into the site. And it was Liam Dewar who was kind of coaxing us on, really, saying, well, actually, you could go a bit further with this material. You could kind of think about it as a monolithic material. And so it was very much a kind of circular conversation with Niall and Liam about developing something that I tried on my site, but pushing it a bit further.
Because when I spoke to you last week, I described it as being sculptural, and you were quite resistant to that label, I think, weren't you? Because you didn't see it as being that. Can we maybe discuss that?
Yeah, I think there was something you said about 5 minutes ago that I much preferred, which was where you described the house, my house here, and you said you never quite see it in the whole. Yeah. It's not that the building's fragmentary, it's not fragmentary at all, but one's experience of it is always a sum of smaller experiences of views, and a lot of those are not of it as a object-like building. They're the sum of views that are inherently contextual and absorb the surroundings and the contents within it. And I think that's something that both the house and the archive share. And I think that kind of resistance to objectness in both buildings, or even the resistance to a sense of a defining image of the building, is part of my kind of hesitancy about the word sculptural.
Elizabeth describes it in the essay as background architecture, which I thought was a great way of describing it. It's always slightly unassuming, but at the same time there's a familiarity to the language because you're using such references. I mean, with the archive particularly, it reads as an agricultural form, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Kind of ad hoc quality to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think Elizabeth's essay was great in that it was not really done through my input. It was very much her response to the work. And actually, the thing that I liked about it is that she qualified the idea of background, and that it's not just this neutral background. It's a background that has a certain qualitative intensity. And yet that qualitative intensity doesn't necessarily push its way, doesn't use its elbows.
Yeah. So you're going to give us a quick tour of this place at some point. We'll have to find out where our wanderers have gone onto the common.
Start now if they're not there.
We're here.
We are here. We're ready and waiting if you want us.
Great.
Can you hear us?
Great. You're outside. Fantastic. Do you want to set the scene for what we're looking at then, please?
We can only see you. We can't see the image full screen.
Oh, it looks great from where I am. A little bit pixely.
Okay. I think we can manage.
Okay.
So you can see the studio in front of us, and one of the key things about this project is that we're on a piece of land, common land, which is part of a piece of publicly accessible land, which is about 2,000 acres, and it's incredibly beautiful. And the part that we're looking at the moment is common land. The National Trust property next to us is Croft Castle, and it's famous for its trees. But I think the thing that's kind of most incredible is that our boundary of our property is right onto the common land. So you can see the big window that overlooks the land, which has sheep, horses, horse riders, walkers, all coming up past this window. It's publicly accessible, and there are many people who have grazing rights and other rights over the land. People that live on in a kind of a settlement that's scattered along the base of the common. And here you can see real life walkers, members of the public. The common stretches for about a mile in the direction that I'm pointing, and about half a mile to the north up there. And there's a slither of wood that belongs to us that we're on the edge of. And our property kind of merges on the other side of this into the National Trust Croft Castle estate. So I think it's an incredible privilege to be in a rural area where we're on such a large piece of publicly accessible land. I think there should be many more commons. They're an incredible thing. It's a kind of rural utopia. And now we're going to take you in to the building.
So, David, can you explain how you deal with the tension of the public and the private? Because obviously there is this sort of boundary condition, but you're almost allowing people in by having this huge window onto your studio, which obviously benefits you in terms of your view, but also starts to change the amount of privacy you can deal with.
Surprisingly, we don't really have that problem, but if people do look in through the window, I basically wave them in to the house inside and explain the project to them. And when they see inside, they kind of get the story, because I really want them to be on our side. You know, I want them to like us and the building, because they feel some kind of ownership. So if I bring them inside and explain how there's an old building inside, they kind of get on our side, and I like that.
So from a conservation point of view, can you maybe explain to people listening why you ended up as you have done, wrapping the building that was there?
Yeah, I will.
There's a building
inside.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's just worth pointing out that the building next door, which you can just about see the roof of, is a listed building, really, because it's old more than anything. And that's our house. And the project, the studio, the ruin that was listed as by virtue of the fact that it was essentially a curtilage listed building. So the conservation officer, we asked him to come and look at this ruin that was being held together by ivy, and we were assuming that he was just going to kind of give us the green light to demolish it. And he said that there was enough there for us to actually keep it, and that he would like us to keep it. And but he wouldn't actually say what was valuable about it or what was interesting about it.
So we're now into the enclosure, really, or what would have been, I guess, a yard of some sort.
I'm just going to go inside now as quickly as I can.
Okay. Hugh,
there's another ruin over here.
Hugh, you haven't been here, have you, since it's been completed?
No.
No.
But yourself, I'm just thinking about your own home, which obviously is a sort of an inverse of this in terms of an enclosure.
Yeah.
You're living within effectively a courtyard settlement. Is that right?
That's
Could we
right.
have to do that while they're getting themselves together?
The other thing that's actually, just while they mention that, one thing that's kind of interesting about their project in the archive is the archive retained this existing wall, and it was exactly the same reason. It was about listing through curtilage. It was a very dilapidated existing building down in Shatwell that had pretty much collapsed, and yet was completely inappropriate for its intended use, but also there was not much left of it, and yet it was listed, and so we were required to retain something,
even though you were arguing for the fact that you were replacing it with something contemporary and effectively of its time. Because
interestingly, it wasn't. Yeah, interestingly, it was something that both Neil Hobhouse and I were very clear that the existing building was that it didn't make sense to repair it and use it for the intended purpose. That just didn't make sense at all. Both of us were quite relaxed about not completely getting rid of it. Neither of us had at any point a sense that it was a kind of an argument worth having. I think we accepted it for what it was. And it's interesting in terms of the relationship between the archive and my house. I think that is a interesting similarity, but also difference, that both projects inhabit a ruin to an extent, and yet in my house, I'll show you in a second, it's somehow completely conceptually integral to the architecture of it. And down in the archives, there's something where it's got an incident, that kind of, the ruins got an incidental quality, which I think is also interesting. I'm not kind of putting that down because of that. I think there's something interesting about it just being there.
Do you want to go and set yourself up, actually, Hugh, while we go back to David and Kate?
Yeah.
You now?
So this is my one thing, actually. This is my office, and that's the view out of my office. So you get the courtyard and the house beyond.
Yes, that's lovely, isn't it?
And actually, the archive shares this sense, and that's the main office space with various models and so on. And I think the archive shares that as well, actually, that sense of having one building and then looking out onto a space and then back into another space. I'm gonna, I don't know, they've got a phone. I'm kind of doing this by...
All right, this is good. We can see where we are. Could you turn around so we could just get a feeling what the studio looks like from that side of the courtyard? Again, this is the kind of conversation about this sort of, the roof just set back slightly to allow the mullions to be expressed.
Yeah.
And coming down onto a larger concrete plinth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's something a little bit, the building has concrete plinths, both of them, and when they're south facing they project, and when they're north facing they flush, so that there's some sense of you being able to sit in the sun.
And where are you now? Oh, he's gone. Has he gone
Maybe
into...
we want to.
No, he's here. Hey.
That's the house. And then, and to some extent, what happens is you inhabit I suppose one of the tricks of the house is that you inhabit the site as much as you inhabit the house.
Yeah, the envelope is just really a layer, isn't it, onto the view. So, but also it almost becomes like a series of sort of medieval alleyways, doesn't it? The way in which you're sort of so close to the edge of the building. Where's he gone? I think we've lost Hugh. David, should we go back to you? Where are you?
Yeah.
Are you in the studio?
Yes. Can you see me now?
I see a strange red outfit and a man.
Okay. Okay.
Probably 80.
I'll just go on. We're in the studio, but I'm just going to go on and show the studio, really. So this is the main cottage. Okay, which this is the bit which is enclosed. And
what's happening up in the loft? And is again,
it's a hay loft. I mean, it was a hay loft or whatever loft, and there's a bird's nest up there. Actually, I'll go up. Now you asked. It's a storage room. I'll see if I can find the bird's nest. I hadn't really planned on this.
we're gonna have a trip to A&E at the end of this, aren't we?
Oh look, the storage room is remarkably tidy. But this is a wall in the storage room. It's rather bloody cool, isn't it? Look, it's just ivy. Can you see that okay?
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. I'm just amazed that you even managed to retain that throughout the whole construction phase.
Yeah, I know. And then there's a load of models here, a load of wasted time and money. And there's a helicopter and more models, more money and time. Oh, yeah, there's the bird's nest. So this is my favorite bit of the whole building. It's called Bird's Nest with Conduit. Can you see it?
Yes.
Isn't that cool? We only discovered that about a year later. But the conduit just goes past the bird's nest. And I really like that detail. And not even Hugh can make a detail like that.
Can you provide...
Okay, I'm going to go down. I'm going to hand the camera down.
Well, yeah, just
go to the studio from up here. maybe that's a good position to see it.
Oh, right, makes sense where the strange red mannequin is.
Yeah. And so you can see this is our workspace. Kate, do you want to perhaps just go over the models down there or something? We just wanted to also show some just kind of work we were doing.
So these are our models of the French project that we were describing, which has been through many different iterations and stages. And these are kind of massing models exploring different approaches. And then this is a picture of Villa Zapu. Dave, do you want to talk about this?
I can't get it ready. Yeah, it's just a picture done by a graffiti artist in New York called Kenny Scharf. And it's an oil painting, in fact. And I just like the fact he did it of our building. And it also became the wine label to go with the house.
How did you come to build the building in the first place? Because it's quite a story, isn't it?
I was just sitting in a restaurant in 11 Park Walk, to be precise, in Chelsea. And I did know these guys who owned this stuff. And I just said, would I like to do a house for them in America? And they had about 300 acres of land. And that's kind of how it started. And I think it went pretty well, really. On the other hand, I think I was also a bit of an idiot at the time. You know, I didn't really know enough, but sometimes that's quite an advantage. I think I would have been a bit more cautious had I known what I was doing, really.
Yeah, and often that's the way in life, isn't it? If you knew what you were letting yourself into, you'd never do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Are you going to, Kate, are you going to take us into the rest of the house so we can see?
Yeah.
Laid out?
One of the things that I like about this project is the undesigned, what's been given to us by the undesigned. So the spaces are really created by the destruction wrought by weathering. So this has got a very low ceiling because most of the ceiling was intact and we just reinforced it so that you could walk on it. This is our kitchen. We've created a kitchen by wrapping IKEA units with stainless steel, and we've made them like pieces of furniture that kind of float away from the walls. And then going into this space, the ceiling collapsed because the roof fell through into it, so that you've got a nice double height space. But you can still see the kind of sockets where the floor joists would have been. And the original staircase would have been here as well. And we've replaced it with our kind of new layer, a steel staircase that was fabricated with some people in Ludlow. All of our subcontractors were local. All of the steel work was produced locally, including the cladding. Even the cladding on the outside of the building was pressed in Leominster, 6 miles away down the road. There's a steel frame, and these steel straps are suspending or fixing the kind of ruin back to the steel frame that's inside the new envelope. So there's a lot of steel in our kind of new vernacular layer. But there's a kind of spatial variation that you get walking through the building that comes from where the floor collapsed, basically. Here there's a window where we've fitted a new window to kind of match where the old window is, but you have to be careful not to cut yourself on pieces of glass as you kind of reach through to open the window. That's one of the hazards, that joys of living here, working here. There's a light a light fitting that's made from some wall ties that were left, we don't know when from, but they were just hanging here amongst all the junk that was in the space. And then we go through to the snug, where again, sorry?
This is my favourite space.
So this is, as we've kind of gone from one end of the building to the other, more and more of it is intact. So the kind of big ghost, the studio space is like the kind of ghost space at the front on the common, but actually most of this room is intact. There is a hole in all of the north side suffered from weather damage. So we do have a kind of double height space here, but we deliberately kept this space kind of darker and more enclosed, and didn't put a roof light in. But there's still a lot of light in this space, but you can kind of see how what's left of this gable is strapped back to the existing building, to the new structure. And then we've got a mezzanine level with a bed, which hopefully you can see. And then moving down some more traces of the old floor. But as you come round, there we can see an architect, part of the new layer, sitting in a modern chair. And then the old fireplace, when you look up, you can see that there's a fireplace up in the air above our heads, which is one of the things I really enjoy. And in it is a head made by David. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, it took me half an hour on the kitchen table, but I think it's really successful. You just pointed the ivy a bit.
Could I ask you about just the general fabric? Because obviously this is the big ivy that's sort of almost falling into the room. But how has the fabric responded to heat and the change in environment and how it's dried and sort of obviously things have shrunk back? Have you had any problems with the building?
No, amazingly enough, it's all kind of stayed intact. I mean, most of it is covered in lime plaster, and we would have thought that would have all just dried out and dropped off, but it actually has remained. I think we have a humidity meter, which tells us how much moisture is in the air. And it seems about right. I mean, these plinth walls that you can just about see are sitting on bare ground, but they're not damp. But there's just enough kind of moisture brought into the air, I think, for it to not get too dry and not too humid at the same time. So actually, there's a kind of gentle fluttering of stuff that just falls onto the floor over the course of a week, but there haven't been any major issues from it drying out, have there?
Interesting. Hugh, can I bring you in here? Because obviously it was a similar question I really wanted to ask you about the archive, because the CLT sits very close to the original fabric of the shed. How has that behaved over time with the kind of the general kind of atmospheric condition of a rural environment?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, they don't sit too close. One of the things about the project is because it's CLT, it's all prefabricated, it's all made up off-site, and doesn't, as a result, take too kindly to site adjustment. So there's this kind of deliberate design decision to kind of create a certain space between the old and the new, which is not necessarily about some kind of architectural rhetoric. It's about the kind of ensuring there's a certain tolerance when we got on site. So actually there's about that much distance between the old and the new, deliberately to allow that. We did design, our engineer Andy Tui's here, we did design some bracing straps between the two to kind of hold the old together, which never got put in. But I think the thing is they ended up doing such a good job repairing the old walls. It ended up less ruinous than we were expecting. So,
but there's no insulation in the building, is that right? Are you just using the thermal mass of the timber itself?
Pretty much. We have the CLTs on the walls and the roof. We have some insulation under the floor, but fundamentally the walls are 300 millimeters thick CLT on the inside and the outside. No insulation, voids, cavities, barriers, anything. And the roof is 400 millimeters, and we just have a ventilation gap and then the fiber cement cladding. So there's no, it's very simple and monolithic. Do you think it would be a good chance to maybe go over and see whether Neil's available so we could have a quick talk? I can see him here. I'm not sure whether he was allowed in as Matt, but he's on Kendra's email. So if they can be made hosts somehow.
Okay, yeah, now.
Yeah. Hello. Great, you're in.
I mean, I think our technology may not stretch to being able to reverse the camera on the screen, but I think I'm just going to turn the Kendra's machine round, and then you can see where we're sitting in the archive itself. I thought it might be just worth saying very quickly that which we just haven't got on to, is that what drawings don't like, we have let's say 20,000 drawings in this room. What they don't like is getting hot and cold and dry and wet on a diurnal cycle. So the idea is that the mass of the building keeps the temperature very stable, and the timber absorbs the moisture. It's not something we've actually tested scientifically. Hugh and I, various efforts to engage engineers in these questions, but at all events, the drawings are still here after 6 or 8 years, and they seem to like the environment. Anyway, let me try turning it round. The other thing you'll see is that, in spite of Hugh's efforts to be puritanical, things have got a little cavalier here, and there are various bits of furniture he won't have seen, and it's quite a mess at the moment because we're preparing for another AF Zoom conversation on Thursday with various participants in our architectural, in our alternative histories exhibition. Anyway, let me turn it round now, and you can get a sense of what can you see something?
Is that working?
Absolutely. No, that works. That works well. And what was interesting, I was talking to Hugh earlier before we came on the show about the photographs that Max Creasy has in Hugh's publication, which are much more chaotic than the space you're showing us now. So is it an ever-changing canvas that you're always moving things around? And
we're always moving things around, and I have to say that in the absence of visitors in the last 3 months, I've been moving furniture. Which, as it were, keeps the cabaret going. I'm just moving the machine around very, very slowly, and then we can take it outside. But really, the building functions at its best when it's full of people. And we've made various films actually using the security camera footage to sort of record the whole sequence of the curation of an exhibition or a long workshop with students that we in fact did it with Elizabeth Hatz's students at a certain point, where you actually see 20 or 30 people milling around, pulling out drawings and so on. I'm sorry I can't provide that for you today.
No, well, you've got your own show coming up, haven't you? So that's okay. We can.
Yes. I should do a little promo for it.
Neil, should we walk outside to the other space?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are changes here, Hugh, too.
Has he gone? Has the Wi-Fi given us power survive?
Can you all see reasonably?
It's a nice picture.
It's great to see it lived in, actually, isn't it? Because it makes a big difference. How often do you go down, Hugh?
Maybe once every 6 months. There's normally an excuse. There's an excuse every 6 months to get down and look at something or share something.
Well, listen. Let's go. Can you see the big Aldo Rossi drawing?
Yeah.
Which we actually just hung here today, and it faces off which probably rather harder to see, a huge photo collage by an Italian fascist architect called Morpurgo for the refurbishment of the tomb of Augustus. So I like this juxtaposition of these two Italian urbanists side by side, or actually not side by side, but facing each other off. So we're gradually changing this room now into something more like a study room, moving material out into this storage section of the building that Clancy Moore are just finishing for us, so that we can use this space for scholars who are visiting, for students, and occasionally for cinema showings, which is, we wanted to run a little season of architectural films next year, if we're allowed to do so.
Neil, if you go outside, it would be great if you could have a look. Let's go back to David.
Can you just...
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you. Carry on, Kate.
We have a visitor.
Well, there you go. You on time, 6:20. Good work.
I can't.
Is this your neighbour?
Yeah. Will Horseman.
Will Horseman.
This is our neighbour, yes. Sorry, we had an
Just drop one of your feeds.
issue with feedback.
So how frequent are you? Are there many people riding across the common? Is it quite a heavily used path?
Can you hear us? Okay. Yeah, this is our neighbour. He's a grazier. He has sheep on the common, and he's also a horse. He'd give us away if he was passing. Sorry about the feedback.
Should we go back to Neil and see where he's got to outside?
No, he's back inside now.
Back inside now?
Yeah.
All very confusing.
I think it's worth saying, Niall, that one of the reasons we're doing this is when we were all talking before this, we'd all quite enjoyed that moment in Mary's talk when she'd looked out the window and we got this glimpse of where she was.
Absolutely, and it starts to put things in context a little bit. I suppose the next question I had for you both was, how has making your own buildings informed the work that you're doing for others? Because I think with Kate and David, obviously it's a very unique approach and possibly something that would be very difficult to sell to others. What about yourself, Hugh?
I think, well, certainly I have my studio is next to the house, and where am I? Have I lost?
No, you're there. We can see you into the courtyard.
Okay, yeah. So my studio's next to the house. So certainly there's something where when we have clients visiting, it's easy to show them the house at the same time and share, I suppose, the ideas and the kind of qualitative spatial effects that those are generating.
I suppose I meant different from that. I meant in the sense of yourself. If you're working in your own architecture, how does it inform the way in which you design for others? Because I know from living in my own architecture that I learned quite a lot through the process of living, good and bad. Mm. That often comes into other projects. I'm not too sure whether that's something you experience yourself.
Yeah, I think I don't know, that's a huge conversation. I certainly think I think 95% of my house I anticipated, and I think I still am surprised by certain things that I thought I understood, but the lived reality is slightly different. But also I think, the house is 10 years old now, and there's something about watching materials age or getting comfortable in a space where you're able to see it less as a designed object, more as a lived space over time, and I think that's really interesting and helpful.
David, do you see this as a private language, your own home, that it's something for you and Kate to indulge in, or do you think it's something that offers any kind of value to the kind of conservation world in terms of how to preserve and rethink how to retain building structures?
It never occurred to me that this had anything to do with conservation, but apparently it does. I didn't really realize that conservation meant conserving something. I mean, I know that clue was in the name, but I thought that you were meant to repair it and show it to the public. That's kind of how I thought conservation worked. But they were very happy to conserve existing building. They were, so long as it was conserved, they didn't really mind what it looked like on the outside or anything, just so long as the existing, 300-year-old frame and so on wasn't damaged. So I was quite surprised by all of that.
We've actually been visited by the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, SPAB, 2 years in a row, by their scholars who go around the country looking at conservation practice and learning kind of traditional conservation techniques. And it's really surprising for us, I think, as kind of considering ourselves contemporary architects, that we're now kind of penciled into their annual tour. And apparently it's sort of textbook Philip Webb, Ruskin conservation practice, what we've done, although that isn't what we set out to do. I think that's quite interesting.
I just find it really frustrating. I mean, I always think we learn something from everything we do. And I'm always kind of frustrated that we can't get on and apply all of that knowledge immediately to something else, because, I mean, the difference between architecture and product design, I mean, apart from sight and everything, is you can't prototype it, But, so you learn things and you kind of try and get better at it. So I'm always just a bit frustrated that I can't bring everything I know to another project immediately, because projects vary so hugely. I mean, now we're working on old people's home in the south of France on a really tight legislation and tight budget. I can't bring all of the stuff we've learned here to this. They just got to learn something new.
And Kate, has it led to any new work on the basis of, because obviously you won the AJ Small Projects with this as well, didn't you?
I think it has. I mean, when we invite new clients to come and meet us here, it's a very direct way of kind of showing, demonstrating kind of attitude to architecture. I've been working for the Quakers of Ludlow on a very tiny restoration, extension project using a listed sort of shed, which it's incredibly modest, but it's enabled me to kind of argue for a particular approach. And also, I think there's probably been at least 2 house projects that we've won because clients have come here and they've sort of seen that. I think people like the kind of combination of sort of carefully thought out details with mad eccentricity, and that seems to have attracted some interesting clients.
Interesting. Hugh, what's your experience been of obviously living and working in your own home? Does it become a calling card for the practice, or do you find it's almost like a ball and chain? I know that there was almost a wish to not necessarily discuss certain projects in this conversation.
Calling card or ball and chain? Maybe both of them. Certainly from a professional point of view, it's a calling card. I think for me, most of my jobs or clients seem to come through architects. They're either friends of or relatives of architects who know my work, and so often that's an architect knows the house and suggests to someone they might contact me.
That's how it sort of evolves. We're going to be running out of time in a minute. I just wanted to ask about the work-life balance, because you're both obviously cheek and jowl with where you live. And I know for many years I was 5 steps from my house to the office, and it nearly killed me because you never switch off. How do you switch off, Kate?
Well, it's quite difficult, but we have a rule that we're not allowed to discuss work in bed, which, believe it or not, has been quite hard to enforce. Our children won't let us discuss work at meal times, and given they're both locked down with us at the moment, although they've sort of left home age, that's another good practice. It's difficult in some ways being close to home for switching off, because it's kind of always here. But do you find it difficult?
No,
Dave?
I don't. But I'm incredibly lazy, and I can switch off pretty easily. I just have to walk 50 yards to my house and watch telly.
Job's done. Hugh, do you find yourself burning the midnight oil because, I'll just go and finish something after dinner? Quite disciplined. You've got young children, haven't you?
Yeah, actually, I find the split works quite well. This the idea of having an office very close to the house but distinct. I think it's brilliant. Actually, most of my colleagues work in evenings or weekends from their house, and I never do that. And yes, I do have to leave the door and walk for 10 seconds over to the studio, but actually having the physical separation does create a distinction. It does mean that it's very rare for me to be in the house working.
Well, sometimes we have big meetings here, or Kate does, and we certainly wouldn't want that in our house. So having a clear separation is really, really good, I think.
Rosie, do you think we've got time for a question from outside? I think there's a call from Frosso Pimientos to say hello.
Sure.
Frosso.
Trying to unmute Frosso.
We found her. Let's see whether she's now co-host. Frosso, are you there? If you want to unmute.
It doesn't seem to be letting me unmute her.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
You're there. Hey. You're
Hey,
in.
great. Yeah, it's rather strange seeing Dave and Kate in public forum. A few questions. I think it's sort of fascinating, but a few questions which I think it's not because of the lockdown and the condition of the whole state of affairs now, but there's a few things that are so fundamental, I think, with you bringing all of these bits together. The whole point that what David said, I've learned something, how do I apply it? I think what I find really refreshing in your work, guys, I cannot see them now, but that's fine, is that I have a pathological affection for heritage and ruins, but not in the way everybody deals with it. So a step further that Kate had done it with Dave, and it would be terribly special and precious and boutiquey and under some stupid theoretical condition that one could talk forever, pointless academic matters. So the balance they got is spot on because it's sort of casual, but really thoughtful. And the whole idea of, how do you connect memory with imagination? And, if this thing I've never been there since they did it, but it feels breathing, it's an alive thing. It's very precious, obviously, but it's not treated as precious. So this idea of part of everyday life, and it's a very extraordinary thing, but the way it's treated, very humble in a way, but then it allows you to dream about what would have been the place. So that's one point that, you look at historic or other modernist sort of approaches to the new and old. It's very difficult to get this balance of sort of casual but deeply thought. The second point is, how can we apply? We all fed up. I mean, we need to be all sustainable and fashionable talking about it, but it's really wrong, irrespective of the pandemic, to live in a city. So this thing that they talked about, the common, as a principle of a utopia, what does the common mean as a collective community? And the third thing which I want to raise is, how did they manage that Mrs. Connor and Mr. Darby did not kill each other? So I just think that it's quite a healthy relationship of, if you keep your own style and your own identity as a designer, then you can work with your partner. But the majority, when you run things, it gets stale. And so I think it's an amazingly healthy, I think, optimistic recognition of freedom. You are bound, but you are free. And then this sense of freedom, I think, is somehow reflected in their work. That it's quite ordered, but it's very free. So for all that, I just want to praise them for that. But it's a big topic, and I just think you can apply one rule, and they've done it once. I don't know what will happen if they find another ruin. And I just think it is a wonderful example of a lesson. The question is, how can you do that when you don't have the privilege of being in such beautiful setting and ruins? You know, so the whole idea of what a ruin is and how you relate, it's a different topic. But well done, guys. I really enjoyed it.
Lovely. Thanks, Frosse, for contributing to the conversation. Hugh, could I just another question that came in, and maybe it's something for you and Neil to respond to, is the relationship with Avara Caesar at the farm, and how that came about. Hugh?
Okay, I'll start, but Neil's certainly got more to. I'll start in terms of my relationship, in that soon after the archive was built and Neil's drawings were in there, two things were happening in parallel. One was that Neil was working with Caesar and housing some of his drawings, particularly of the Malagueira project. And in parallel, I was working on the silos adjacent. And there were a couple of things that kind of, we were happy with the design of the silos, but I was kind of intrigued by the fact that Caesar was busy visiting the archive at the same time. So I mentioned to Neil, well, why don't you see what Caesar thinks of this thing we're grappling with? And it led to an interesting collaboration. Caesar was intrigued by the project, and I kind of went over there a few times, showed our work to him, and he contributed, and we kind of developed something together. And that was all kind of very much in kind of parallel with the Malagueira drawings coming to the archive.
Neil, would you like to add to that, please?
Only to say that I'm sorry to say that neither Hugh's scheme nor Caesar's scheme was executed in relation to the silos. Partly, I think, because I've decided that the silos are, their best role is in provoking architects to make propositions. And the moment that we actually build something, I think that this narrative will end. But in the event, we did bring here the yellow columns from the Burlington House courtyard from his Sensing Spaces show, and we have those out in the yard. And he says very generously that they look better here than they did in Piccadilly. I can't tell you if it's true.
Right, that's a great way to end. Thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you to Frosse, thank you to Hugh, obviously, and Kate and David, and Rosie and Alice for organising. That's all we've got time for this week. We'll be back in a fortnight with Takashi Hayatsu and Tom Randall Page. Thanks very much. Goodbye.